Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Today we are starting off with the murder of Faith Hedgepeth, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 2012. The campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is quiet at night. In September 2012, the streets and sidewalks were still, the dormitories dark, and the late summer air carried a soft humidity that clung to the city. Students were asleep, exhausted from classes, social events, or part-time jobs. Among them was Faith Hedgepeth, 19, a talented student with a bright future. She was known for her intellect, her humor, and her unwavering kindness. Someone who lit up rooms and inspired those around her. But on the night of September 7th, Faith's light was about to be extinguished. Faith lived off campus, in a modest apartment she shared with a roommate. That evening, she returned home after a quiet night out. Neighbors recalled seeing lights on, doors locked, and the usual hum of a young student settling in for the night. Everything appeared normal. No one knew that a stranger was already watching, waiting, preparing to enter the apartment without leaving a trace of forced entry. Faith's roommate was away that night. Alone in the apartment, Faith was vulnerable, yet unaware. Around midnight, someone entered the apartment. Investigators later pieced together evidence, suggesting that the intruder was likely known to her, someone who could have easily gained access without suspicion. The motive remained uncertain, a question that would haunt detectives for years. By morning, Faith's body was discovered. She had been brutally attacked, her life taken in the very place she felt safest. The scene shocked the community. A young, vibrant student killed in her own home in a town that prided itself on safety and academic excellence. Investigators immediately launched a full-scale inquiry. They reviewed her phone records, her social media activity, and the comings and goings around her apartment. Neighbors were interviewed. Friends were questioned. Yet for months, the case remained frustratingly opaque. There were no witnesses, no conclusive leads, no clear suspects. It was as if the violence had come from the shadows, unseen and unprovoked. The family, devastated, struggled with grief while desperately seeking answers. Faith's murder became not just a criminal investigation, but a story that touched the heart of Chapel Hill. Vigils were held, flowers were laid at the scene, and the campus community mourned a life stolen too soon. The investigation explored multiple angles. Detectives examined the possibility of someone with a personal connection, an acquaintance, a classmate, or a friend who might have targeted Faith. DNA evidence was collected and compared against national databases. The home was meticulously combed for forensic traces, from fingerprints to fibers, to anything that might reveal the assailant's identity. Despite these efforts, years passed with limited progress. Faith's case became one of the most haunting unsolved murders in North Carolina. Each new tip was pursued, each lead investigated, but the killer remained elusive, slipping through the cracks of time and evidence. For Faith's family, every day without resolution was a reminder of the fragility of life and the uncertainty of justice. For the community, her death represented a quiet terror, the realization that someone could be taken in a place they believed to be safe. Friends and students became more cautious, security measures increased, and the once ordinary apartments and streets seemed shadowed by possibility and fear. Yet amidst the grief, Faith's memory endured. Her accomplishments, her laughter, and the light she brought into every room were celebrated and remembered. Vigils, scholarships, and remembrances became a way to honor her life, even as her killer remained unknown. The case of Faith Hedgepeth reminds us that evil can strike without warning in the most ordinary spaces and to those who seem most secure. It is a story that lingers quietly, haunting hallways and neighborhoods, leaving a trace not of evidence, but of absence. A young life ended, and questions that may never be answered. Even now, years later, residents of Chapel Hill speak her name softly, remembering a student who walked among them, whose life was stolen in a night that should have been ordinary, and whose legacy endures in the hearts of those who loved her. Next story, the murder of Missy Beavers, 2016. Night comes quietly over Midlothian, Texas. It settles low over the fields and parking lots, muting color, softening edges, and turning every building into a silhouette. By 4 a.m., the town is almost silent, the kind of silence that feels suspended as though the world is holding its breath. Inside the Creekside Church of Christ, motion sensor lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the long, empty hallways. The church was the kind of place where days were busy with weddings, Bible studies, bake sales, and scouts meetings. But in the early hours of April 18, 2016, the building stood empty, a cavern of polished floors and still air. At 4:16 a.m., those lights caught the first sign of movement. A lone figure, slow, deliberate, and dressed in full tactical gear, entered the hallway. The reflective letters across the vest read police, though there was something off about it, something not quite right. The patches, the helmet, even the gait, none of it looked like law enforcement. More like a costume, a disguise. Whoever they were, they walked casually, almost leisurely, tapping at doors with a hammer, swinging it against the metal frames, checking rooms as though they had all the time in the world. They weren't rushed. They weren't nervous. They moved with purpose, but without urgency. They were waiting. 45 minutes later, before sunrise tinted the horizon, Missy Beavers pulled into the church parking lot. Missy was a fitness instructor, strong, energetic, and loved by her students. She was known for early morning boot camps and motivational messages on her social media. That morning was no different. She had posted a message at 3:50 a.m., encouraging her class to push through the stormy weather and show up. Even the rain couldn't dim her enthusiasm. She carried her gear in through the rear entrance, the same door her students used. The building was dark, but her footsteps echoed with familiarity. She had taught here countless times. Nothing about this morning should have felt different, but it did. She didn't know it, but she wasn't alone. The timeline that followed lasted only a few minutes, but investigators would spend years trying to understand what happened within that window. At 4:20 a.m., Missy entered the hallway. At that same moment, the intruder, the person in tactical gear, turned toward her. There was no footage of the attack itself. No camera showed the struggle, only the before and the after. The next 20 minutes were a void. At 5 a.m., her students began arriving. They walked in talking quietly, their gym bags slung over their shoulders, expecting to hear Missy's voice calling them together. Instead, the church was silent, too silent. And then they found her. Missy Beavers lay on the floor of the main hallway, surrounded by shattered glass, her body beaten, wounded, and still. Her gear bag had spilled, her belongings were scattered, and the person she had unknowingly walked toward, the figure in tactical gear, was gone. The students called 911. By the time police arrived, the intruder had vanished without a trace. News of Missy's death spread fast, through her family, her students, and the entire community. Her husband, Brandon, was away on a fishing trip hundreds of miles from home. When he received the call, he described the world going silent, like someone had dropped him into a dark room and closed the door. Her 3 daughters were still asleep when officers came to the house. They woke to a nightmare that never lifted. The footage, the grainy, haunting security footage, was released soon after. It showed the intruder wandering through the church long before Missy arrived, their posture almost relaxed. People fixated on the walk, the strange, outward-turned step, the slight limp, the swinging of the hammer, the way they moved room to room almost passively, not searching violently, not stealing anything, not vandalizing anything beyond a few broken windows. It was as if they were simply waiting. That single detail became the cornerstone of the investigation. Had the killer come to the church specifically for Missy? Detectives first looked at forced entry, or rather, the lack of it. The intruder had entered through a side door by breaking glass that was already compromised. It wasn't a dramatic break-in. It looked staged, as though the person wanted it to appear as a burglary gone wrong. But nothing was stolen. No electronics. No money. Not even Missy's belongings. This wasn't a burglary. It was an attack with a singular purpose. Then came the theories. If the killer knew Missy's schedule, and many people did, they would have known she always arrived early for her class. She posted her workout times on Facebook. Her students tagged her in stories. Anyone could have tracked her routine. But the intruder's timing was too perfect. They arrived before she did. They stayed inside. They moved through the hallways with patience. Detectives wondered, had they been there even earlier? Had they watched her arrive? Had they been watching her for longer than anyone realized? Missy's life was examined piece by piece. There were rumors of relationship issues, vague, unconfirmed, the kind of speculation that emerges whenever tragedy strikes. Investigators looked closely into her marriage, into her social media messages, into old texts and exchanges. They brought people in for questioning, more out of necessity than suspicion. No one was ever charged. Then attention turned to the gear. Why tactical gear? Why a police vest? Some believed it was meant to intimidate. Others believed it was meant to mislead. Still, others suggested a darker possibility, that the disguise wasn't meant for Missy, but for whoever might encounter the killer before she arrived. That a passerby might assume the intruder was law enforcement and think nothing of it. The most unsettling part was the intruder's composure. They weren't frantic. They didn't pace. They didn't appear lost. They moved through the building like someone walking through their own home. As the investigation deepened, detectives reviewed over 2,000 tips, dozens of interviews, and countless hours of surveillance footage from nearby businesses. They tracked vehicles in the area. They analyzed footprints. They even studied the intruder's height and build frame by frame. But every trail led back to the same place. A hallway in a quiet church. A figure in tactical gear. A murder with no clear motive. And a timeline that refused to reveal the truth. The hardest part for the community wasn't the footage. It was the silence afterward. The church was cleaned, but the memory lingered. Her fitness classes resumed elsewhere, but none felt the same. Her family lived with questions that no one could answer. Missy's daughters grew older, carrying a story they never asked for. Her husband maintained his innocence through public scrutiny, standing by the belief that whoever had done this had planned it carefully and planned it alone. Detectives continued working the case, but as months turned into years, the leads dwindled. The footage remained haunting, the slow steps, the hammer swinging, the armor that was never real. People still argue about the walk, who it resembles, who it might be. Entire forums dedicate themselves to studying the intruder's shoes, posture, height, even the tilt of their head. But the figure remains anonymous. A shadow in a hallway. A stranger behind a mask. A person who vanished back into the rain-soaked dawn. Some nights, the church lights still flicker on after dark. Volunteers say the building settles strangely, its long hallways echoing in ways that make footsteps sound closer than they are. And sometimes people swear that, just at the edge of those dim halls, they see a shape reflected in the polished floor, a silhouette moving room to room, slow and deliberate, as though retracing steps from a morning that never truly ended. A reminder that some killers don't disappear into legend or folklore. Some simply walk away and never return. Next story, the Colonial Parkway Murders, Virginia, 1986 to 1989. The Colonial Parkway stretches through Virginia, a winding ribbon of road flanked by dense woods and marshlands, connecting historic Williamsburg, Yorktown, and Jamestown. By night, it is a quiet, isolated corridor, the kind of place where the darkness feels complete, pressing against the headlights of any passing vehicle. Between 1986 and 1989, this quiet stretch of road became the stage for one of the most chilling, unsolved crime sprees in American history. The victims were young couples, often in cars parked along the scenic overlooks or quiet pull-offs. They were ordinary students, friends, lovers on weekend trips, enjoying the privacy and tranquility that the parkway promised. But the serene beauty of the area belied the presence of a predator who would turn moments of intimacy into moments of terror. The first known murders occurred in July 1986. Christopher and Suzanne Newport, a young couple visiting the area were discovered shot in their car. Their vehicle was parked at a quiet overlook, and there were no signs of struggle beyond the immediate violence. At first, police treated it as an isolated act, a tragedy perhaps linked to robbery or chance. But there was no robbery. Nothing had been taken. Weeks later, the pattern began to emerge. Other young couples disappeared, only to be found later in similar circumstances. Shot, sometimes staged, often left where they had pulled over, surrounded by the darkness of the parkway. Investigators noted the consistency. The killer targeted couples in secluded spots. The attacks were sudden, violent, and efficient. He left little forensic evidence behind, moving with precision and planning. Forensic technology at the time was limited, and the killer's meticulous methods ensured that little could be traced to a single individual. Each discovery sent shockwaves through the region. Families were devastated. College students and tourists learned quickly to avoid the parkway at night. Law enforcement increased patrols, but the killer seemed always one step ahead. He struck unpredictably, sometimes months apart, sometimes in rapid succession, creating an almost mythical presence, a shadow along the winding road. The victims' profiles were consistent. Young, often college-aged, traveling with someone they trusted. The public grew fearful, and locals warned each other to avoid late-night drives, particularly to secluded overlooks. Despite these warnings, the killer continued, striking again and again. Investigators formed task forces combining local, state, and federal resources. Profiles were drawn, suspects questioned, and every lead examined. However, the killer left no fingerprints, no reliable eyewitnesses, and no confession. The evidence was almost entirely circumstantial. Shell casings, tire tracks, and witness descriptions of vehicles seen in the area at odd hours. Some theories suggested a single murderer, others speculated about multiple perpetrators. Law enforcement examined suspects with criminal histories, behavioral patterns, and ties to the region. Despite these efforts, no one was ever definitively charged. Over time, the Colonial Parkway murders became a cautionary tale, a reminder that danger can lurk even in the most scenic and serene places. The woods, the winding roads, and the isolated pull-offs, meant to be symbols of leisure and beauty, became spaces of fear. Families drove cautiously, couples avoided late-night excursions, and the parkway's reputation shifted from scenic to sinister. Decades later, the cases remain unsolved. Investigators continue to review old evidence using modern forensic techniques, hoping to finally identify the person responsible. Cold case files are studied repeatedly, as every new technological advancement offers a glimmer of hope. The Colonial Parkway is still beautiful. Sunlight filters through the trees, wildlife roams the edges, and the road curves gracefully along rivers and forests. But the darkness remains. Travelers know, even unconsciously, that a shadow once moved among the trees, patient, precise, and unseen. The murders are a haunting reminder that evil often strikes without pattern visible to the untrained eye, that a predator can hide in plain sight along roads meant for leisure, and that even the most ordinary moments, a parked car, a shared smile, a quiet drive, can be shattered in an instant. Even today, when night falls over the Colonial Parkway and the headlights cut through the dense Virginia forests, one can imagine the presence that once stalked its curves. A predator gone, perhaps, but the fear and mystery remain, lingering like mist in the trees, a dark thread through the beauty of the parkway. Next story, the abduction of Jamie Kloss, Barron, Wisconsin, 2018. The cold winter air hung thick over Barron, Wisconsin, in the early hours of October 15, 2018. Snow blanketed the quiet streets, muffling the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Most homes were dark, the occupants fast asleep, unaware that in one house on the outskirts of town, a nightmare was quietly unfolding. Jamie Lynn Kloss, 13, had gone to bed as usual. Her life was ordinary: school, friends, basketball practice, and time spent with her parents. That night, she had said goodnight to her parents, James and Denise Kloss, who were preparing for the next day. But the routine of bedtime, the security of familiar walls, will be broken forever. Just after 2 a.m., a shadow appeared outside the Kloss home. The perpetrator had watched the house, studied the routines, and knew the patterns of the family. With tools in hand and intent in mind, he forced entry, bypassing locks and alarms with the precision of someone who had planned every detail. Inside, chaos erupted in minutes. Shots rang out, shattering the quiet of the neighborhood. Denise and James Kloss were killed in their own home, their lives taken with brutal efficiency. Jamie, terrified and hidden in the darkness, became the target of a carefully orchestrated abduction. The streets remained still as neighbors, unaware, slept through the sounds of terror. When dawn arrived, the home was empty in ways no one could comprehend. The parents were found later by authorities, but Jamie was missing. Investigators immediately suspected foul play. The abduction of a child was rare in Barron, a community that prided itself on safety and trust. Law enforcement canvassed the area, reviewing camera footage from surrounding homes, traffic cameras, and local businesses. Every detail was scrutinized. The search for Jamie became urgent and relentless. Authorities traced the abductor's movements, noting the path through the woods, across fields, and into a remote cabin far from the town. Every mile was a race against time. For 88 days, Jamie was held captive. Her abductor, Jake Patterson, had secluded her in a cabin with minimal contact with the outside world. The girl endured confinement, fear, and the psychological weight of the murders she had witnessed. Yet, despite the terror, Jamie remained alert, observant, and resilient, qualities that would become crucial to her survival. Authorities worked tirelessly, issuing alerts, analyzing leads, and interviewing anyone connected to the area. The community's attention never wavered, as local residents organized search parties and kept watch over every street and wooded trail. On January 10th, 2019, Jamie seized a moment of opportunity. Patterson had grown careless. He allowed her a small window of independence outside the cabin. Jamie ran through the cold, the snow, the early morning stillness, and flagged down a passing woman whose swift call to 911 finally brought her to safety. The relief was immense, but accompanied by shock and grief. Jamie had survived, but the memory of her parents' murders would remain. She had endured months of isolation, fear, and captivity, yet she emerged alive, her courage marking her as remarkable. Jake Patterson was arrested shortly after Jamie's escape. Evidence collected from the cabin, the surrounding area, and digital traces linked him undeniably to the crimes. He confessed to the abduction and murders, though his motives were a chilling mixture of obsession and premeditation. The trial was a somber affair. The town of Barron watched as the details unfolded. The meticulous planning, the brutality, and the psychological control exerted over Jamie. The case became a symbol of both horror and resilience, the darkness of human intent, and the indomitable strength of a young girl who survived against all odds. Even now, the memory of those early morning hours lingers in Barron. Neighbors remember the quiet streets, the normalcy that masked the danger within, and the relief that followed Jamie's return. Her story became a testament to vigilance, community solidarity, and the courage of someone who refused to be defeated by fear. The snow that blankets Barron in winter now carries a weight of memory, of a girl who ran through the silence and emerged into freedom, and of a town that learned, in the most painful way, that evil can hide behind familiar doors. Next story, the disappearance of Susan Cox Powell, Utah, 2009. The suburbs of West Valley City, Utah, seemed calm in the winter of December 2009. Snow-dusted lawns and rooftops, the streets were quiet, and most households were tucked away behind closed doors, the lights dimmed against the early dusk. But in one home, a darkness was about to settle that no snow could soften. Susan Cox Powell, 28, was a young mother with 2 sons. Friends described her as vibrant, intelligent, and deeply protective of her family. She and her husband, Joshua Powell, had moved to Utah for work and family. On the morning of December 6, 2009, Susan kissed her children goodbye and drove to run errands. A routine morning in a seemingly ordinary life. By evening, Susan had vanished. Her husband reported her missing, claiming she had left voluntarily. But neighbors and friends noticed something was off. Her car was parked in the driveway. Her purse, phone, and belongings were still in the house. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if she had simply walked out into the night and ceased to exist. Investigators quickly focused on the home itself. The Powell residence appeared normal, but detectives noted small details that hinted at a more complex picture. Joshua Powell was cooperative, but his behavior seemed controlled, almost too deliberate. Friends reported tension in the marriage, arguments about finances, control, and independence. Susan's friends said she had expressed fear of leaving home alone, a subtle anxiety that now took on alarming significance. The search for Susan was immediate and thorough. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, checked surveillance cameras, and interviewed family, friends, and colleagues. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no trace. No sightings, no phone activity, no clue as to where she might have gone. As investigators dug deeper, they examined Joshua's behavior more closely. He had been the last person to see Susan. His statements contained inconsistencies, small at first, but significant upon review. He claimed she had left without saying goodbye, yet their communication logs suggested recent tension, arguments, and discussions about separation. Detectives began to consider the possibility that Susan's disappearance was not voluntary. The home was searched for evidence. Detectives noted unusual computer activity, searches for chemicals, chains, and restraints. They reviewed phone records, bank accounts, and emails. Everything pointed toward careful planning, someone who wanted to erase the traces of a person without leaving a scene that would attract attention. But Susan remained missing. Months passed. The children remained in the care of family members. The public became aware of the case through media coverage, and the story took on national attention. Every tip was followed, every sighting checked. Volunteers walked miles of snowy fields and riverbanks, hoping to find a clue. Still, Susan's disappearance remained an enigma. The investigation expanded beyond Utah. Authorities examined Joshua Powell's past, his movements, his behavior in prior relationships, and his social interactions. There were whispers of controlling tendencies, of a man who sought to dominate every aspect of his household. But nothing concrete linked him to Susan's disappearance. At least, nothing that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. Then, in 2012, tragedy struck again. Joshua Powell killed himself and their two young sons in a house fire in Washington state. The act was violent, deliberate, and irreversible. With their deaths, Susan's disappearance took on a grim permanence. The children, who had survived her absence, were now gone as well. Investigators pieced together the timeline of the family's movements, the phone records, and Joshua Powell's behavior. Though Susan's body was never recovered, authorities concluded that she had likely been killed at the hands of her husband. The details, precise, careful, and hidden, painted a picture of premeditation, control, and a calculated attempt to remove her from the world entirely. The case shook the community. Susan's friends, family, and neighbors struggled to understand how a vibrant young woman could vanish without a trace, and how the person closest to her could be the likely perpetrator. Her absence left a void that no investigation could fill, and the deaths of her children amplified the grief into something unbearable. Media coverage focused on the dangers of domestic control and the warning signs often missed by friends, neighbors, and sometimes even authorities. Susan Cox Powell's story became a cautionary tale, one of trust betrayed and normalcy shattered by the darkest intentions within a home. Even now, years later, when the snow falls over West Valley City and the streets lie silent, people remember Susan. Her disappearance is not just a mystery. It is a shadow that lingers in quiet neighborhoods, A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary homes can conceal the most extraordinary darkness. And in the empty spaces where she once walked, one can almost feel the presence of a life interrupted, a family undone, and a world that was never quite the same. Before we dive into the next case, if you're enjoying these stories, consider giving a like and subscribing. It really helps me bring you more. Now, on to our next story. The disappearance of Carly Pearce Stevenson in Candlelice, Australia, 2010 to 2015. Night had already fallen over the small town of Alice Springs, Northern Territory, when Carly Pearce Stevenson returned home on December 1st, 2010. The streets were quiet, dust rising in faint eddies under the streetlights, the kind of stillness that made even distant sounds, a dog barking, a car engine starting, seemed sharp and immediate. The air carried the warmth of the day, drawing slowly into the cool embrace of desert evening. Carly, 27, had been a single mother, careful and resilient. Her routine was ordinary: care for her daughter Candlelice, check in with friends, manage the small household that marked her independence. On that night, she spoke briefly to friends online, sent a few text messages, and then returned inside her modest apartment. Her belongings were neatly arranged: a backpack by the door, a small stack of laundry waiting on a chair, a half-read book on the couch. The television flickered quietly, illuminating the walls with muted color. No one saw her leave again. The next days brought missed appointments, unanswered calls, and rising concern from friends and family. Police inquiries began quietly. Officers reviewed phone records, checked local CCTV, and visited neighbors. Some recalled seeing a small, dark car parked near her home, lingering longer than seemed ordinary. Others mentioned a man seen speaking with her in passing. Details were scarce, fragmentary, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Months later, in 2015, the discovery of human remains in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales brought the case into sharper focus. A charred and decomposed body was uncovered, the aftermath of fire concealing identity and detail. Forensic work would later confirm the remains belonged to Carly Pearce Stevenson. The methods used to hide her presence and the distance between the location of disappearance and where her body was found suggested a careful, deliberate effort to erase traces. Investigators traced connections to Carly's life: acquaintances, ex-partners, transient relationships. They interviewed anyone who might recall the last time she was seen, the people she encountered, the movements she made. Subtle details emerged: a friend who had lent her a ride, a local store employee recalling a brief exchange, a fleeting glimpse of someone following her path that night. Each piece of information was small, measured, but together they began to form a shadowed outline of what had happened. The case took another turn when authorities discovered Candlelice. Carly's young daughter had also gone missing. Her body was later found concealed in a rubbish bin near the suburb of Mount Gambier, South Australia. The temporal gap between mother and child's deaths and the deliberate placement of Candlelice's body added layers of chilling calculation. Investigators reconstructed movements, tried to determine opportunity, and considered the possibility of a single perpetrator orchestrating both disappearances. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement worked methodically, comparing DNA evidence, retracing steps across state lines, following witness statements that sometimes contradicted one another. The towns and communities involved were drawn into the slow, painstaking work of piecing together absence. Streets, houses, and paths once ordinary became sites of observation. Everything, from a car parked too long to a note left behind, became part of the unfolding, meticulous examination. What remained haunting was the sequence of decisions, movements, and omissions that allowed both mother and child to vanish. Even years later, certain questions lingered. The forest where Carly's remains were found retained a quiet, almost indifferent air. Trees swaying gently in the wind, the soft crackle of underbrush underfoot, the lingering scent of smoke from years past. The streets near Mount Gambier, calm and suburban, concealed the past with ordinary facades: fences, lawns, quiet cars and driveways. masking the traces of tragedy that had unfolded there. Investigators and families continued to follow leads, each new tip a small, deliberate probe into the shadows. Yet the silence of the land, the quiet persistence of absence, remained a defining element. The case endured as a slow unraveling, a deliberate, measured mystery in which every ordinary detail might hold significance, and every unanswered question left space for lingering unease. Next story, the disappearance of Marion Barter, Sydney, Australia, 1997. Night had settled over Sydney, the city's lights reflecting softly against the waters of the harbor, dimming into the quiet suburbs where life slowed to a near whisper. In the neighborhood where Marion Barter lived, the streets were lined with modest homes, their gardens dusted in late summer dew. By 10 p.m., the only sounds were the occasional distant car, the hum of streetlights, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The calm felt suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. Marion, a devoted mother in her mid-40s, had long maintained a routine marked by precision and quiet order. Her mornings were for early walks, her evenings for planning and reflection. She balanced family life with a career in education, handling both with meticulous care. Her home was tidy, her diary organized, her phone always within reach. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Marion had begun making preparations for an extended trip overseas. Travel documents, passports, flight arrangements, each step recorded in careful detail. She left subtle notes around her home, messages meant to ensure continuity for her children and family during her absence. Each note reflected thoughtfulness, foresight, and a routine she never broke. On the evening of November 15th, 1997, she completed her packing. Her suitcase rested in the corner of her bedroom, neatly folded clothes stacked and secured. She set her alarm, reviewed her itinerary, and went to bed as she had many nights before. Outside, the air was still, carrying the faint smell of nearby eucalyptus trees. The next morning, Marion was gone. Her absence was first noted when she did not attend her planned appointment. Her family, accustomed to her punctuality, sensed immediately that something was amiss. Calls went unanswered. Text messages remained unread. The familiar chime of her phone, so constant in her daily life, was absent. Authorities were notified, and the investigation began in earnest. Officers visited her home, examined her belongings, her packed suitcase, her notes, and correspondence. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. The door was locked, the windows secure. Her car remained parked in the driveway, keys inside. Investigators traced her travel plans. They verified flights, contacted airlines, and checked accommodations. Each lead ended with more questions than answers. Phone records revealed calls to family and friends that were ordinary, unremarkable. A calm voice, a plan discussed, a farewell never truly realized. Marion's disappearance led police to canvass neighbors in the local area. Surveillance footage from nearby streets captured little beyond the ordinary. Pedestrians moving homeward, the occasional vehicle passing quietly. Yet nothing definitive, no trace of Marion stepping into the unknown. Her family experienced a slow, pervasive grief. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, each day marked by unanswered questions and small, haunting reminders. Her children returned to empty spaces at home. Her friends replayed their last interactions, wondering if they had missed subtle signs, overlooked a word or gesture that could have indicated something more. Despite ongoing investigation, Marion Barter has never been found. The case remains one of Australia's most confounding disappearances. Speculation surrounds potential motives, voluntary departure, foul play, or circumstances beyond understanding. Authorities continue to review evidence, revisit interviews, and explore leads, but the core mystery remains. Where did Marion go, and why did she vanish without a trace? Some evenings, the quiet streets of her neighborhood still carry a lingering sense of absence. Neighbors pass by her home, now occupied by others, sensing the faint echo of routines left behind, a suitcase still packed in memory, footsteps never retraced. And for those who remember Marion, her disappearance is a shadow that stretches over time, a question without an answer, suspended in the still night. Next story, the disappearance of Michaela Bali, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, 2016. Night had already settled over Calgary, softening the edges of streets and buildings, muting colors under the dim glow of streetlights. The winter air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and the distant hum of traffic along major thoroughfares. By 10 p.m., most neighborhoods were quiet, save for the occasional barking dog or the rustle of leaves across driveways. The quiet was deep, the kind that feels suspended, as though the world were holding its breath. Michaela Bali, just 16 years old, lived with her mother and younger siblings in a modest suburban home. She had the energy and curiosity of youth, a love of music, a circle of friends she texted and called late into the night, and the routines of a typical teenager, checking social media, finishing homework, preparing for school the next day. On the night of November 27, 2016, Michaela's evening began unremarkably. She ate dinner, shared brief conversation with her family, and settled into her room. Her phone lay nearby, charging, notifications lighting up the screen intermittently. Outside, the streets were quiet. Neighbors' homes glowed softly through curtain windows. Shortly after 10:30 p.m., she stepped outside briefly, reportedly to retrieve something from her car. The snow crunched under her boots. Her jacket zipped up to her chin, her hood pulled over her head. She checked the driveway and the small walkway leading to the street. There was no one else in sight. The quiet was complete, almost watchful. No one saw her leave. No one followed. And yet, within that ordinary moment, Michaela vanished. The next morning, her absence became apparent. She hadn't returned to her room overnight. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Texts remained unread. Alarms spread quietly but quickly through her family. They checked local areas, neighbors, and familiar haunts. Nothing. The police were called. Investigators began retracing her last known movements, starting with her home, then the surrounding streets. Surveillance footage was examined. Street cameras, nearby businesses, traffic intersections. Some glimpses were found. A fleeting figure moving along the road, the shape partially obscured, the pace deliberate. Investigators noted the detail of her boots in the snow, the faint shimmer of her jacket in the cold streetlights. Tips began arriving immediately from friends, classmates, and the broader community. Each call, each message, painted pieces of Michaela's life, her routines, and the people she knew. Authorities collected statements, examined digital footprints, and mapped her online activity. Yet no one could explain where she had gone. The investigation revealed patterns similar to other disappearances of young girls in Alberta: solitary travel, late-night routines, and vulnerable moments along familiar paths. Authorities considered possibilities: abduction, voluntary departure, encounters with strangers. Each theory was weighed carefully, methodically, without rush or dramatization. The emotional toll on Michaela's family was profound. Parents described a sense of silence that filled their home, a quiet that pressed into every room. Siblings adjusted to the absence, the unanswered questions, the pauses where laughter once echoed. Friends held vigils, shared memories online, and waited for any trace that could illuminate her path. Despite years of investigation, Michaela remains missing. Her case is one among several that haunt Calgary and the broader region, a reminder that ordinary nights can hold extraordinary uncertainty. Streets and homes, once safe and familiar, are shadowed by the memory of absence. Some nights, residents say the snow along quiet streets seems to shimmer differently, as if carrying echoes of steps never retraced, footprints never recovered. The faint glow of streetlights may catch on a jacket sleeve, or the shape of a figure just at the periphery of vision. And for those who remember Michaela Bali, the silence is enduring, the waiting interminable, and the questions remain, lingering, quiet, and unresolved. Next story, The Highway of Tears Cases, Canada, 1969 to 2006. Night stretched across the remote stretches of Highway 16, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forests and mountains of northern British Columbia. The wind whispered through the towering evergreens, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Fog rolled low over the road in the early hours, muffling the occasional hum of a distant truck. Street lights were few and far between. Only the faint glint of reflective signs marked the edges of the highway. By 2 a.m., the corridor was almost entirely silent, the kind of quiet that feels suspended, as though the world itself were holding its breath. For decades, young women and girls traveled these roads, walking from town to town, hitchhiking, or relying on sparse bus routes. Some were heading home, some were visiting friends or family. Many carried small bags with essentials, jackets pulled tight against the cold, shoes scuffed from long walks. Ordinary items, ordinary journeys, ordinary nights that would become the settings of extraordinary tragedy. Among those journeys, a pattern slowly emerged. Women leaving familiar towns were disappearing. They weren't always taken from crowded streets or bustling intersections. Most vanishings occurred along isolated stretches of the highway, near logging roads, near rest areas that were little more than gravel clearings. Investigators noted the consistent gaps between where they were last seen and where evidence was eventually discovered, often hours or even days later. The victims varied in age, background, and life circumstance, but each shared the same vulnerability, traveling alone through sparsely populated terrain. They weren't rushed. They weren't reckless. They moved with purpose, heading to destinations known and familiar. And somewhere along those winding roads, someone or something intercepted them. Investigators pieced together fragments from witness accounts, discarded personal items, and the occasional surveillance or highway patrol note. Shoes left behind, a purse discarded in brush, faint tire tracks in the mud. The details were small, quiet, almost imperceptible, but together they painted a haunting image of isolation and opportunity. Communities along Highway 16 became wary. Families advised daughters against walking alone. Drivers stopped watching the road with casual attention. Every lone figure along the highway became a silent concern, a reminder that danger moved quietly. Some cases were solved. Perpetrators were eventually identified and prosecuted. Others remain unresolved, leaving only questions that stretch across decades. For families, the uncertainty was relentless. Every year, anniversaries brought quiet reflection, remembering ordinary mornings that ended with permanent absence. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends lived with the knowledge that a familiar face had been taken, often leaving behind nothing but silence and the faintest traces. The highway itself seems to carry the weight of memory. Fog drifts through the trees like whispered reminders. Empty rest areas echo with imagined footsteps. The wind through the evergreens carries a hush that reminds travelers of the fragility of ordinary nights. Even today, drivers along Highway 16 describe a quiet tension, an awareness that the road holds histories invisible to the casual eye. And for those who know the stories, each mile carries the echo of journeys interrupted, of lives quietly vanished into the night. Next story, The Murder of Millie Dowler, Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, 2002. Night fell quietly over Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, in March of 2002. The sky had darkened to a soft, muted gray, and a thin drizzle left the streets slick and reflective under the dim glow of streetlights. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and freshly mown lawns, and the occasional distant hum of a car, engine, punctuated the otherwise profound silence. Homes were dark, curtains drawn, and the town seemed to hold its breath, unaware that a young life was about to vanish into uncertainty. Millie Dowler, a bright, cheerful, and thoughtful 13-year-old, had just finished her school day. She was known for her gentle nature, her warmth toward friends and family, and her love of music and reading. That evening, she left her home carrying a small bag, her phone tucked safely inside, and a bundle of papers for homework. Her routine was simple: walk home from school, change into comfortable clothes, perhaps play a record or chat with her family about the day. But that evening, something changed. A normal walk became the last known steps anyone would ever see her take. The streets she had crossed countless times suddenly carried an unfamiliar tension. The lamplight, the drizzle, the quiet of the neighborhood. Each element now seemed to mark the edges of a story that would unfold slowly, painfully, and with lingering questions. Somewhere nearby, a figure moved with careful discretion. Someone watching, waiting, attuned to the rhythms of the town and the routines of its residents. They weren't hurried. They weren't careless. Their movements were deliberate, almost imperceptible. A shadow among shadows, they blended into the muted landscape, their presence unnoticed but crucial in the timeline that would follow. Millie's disappearance was discovered later that evening when she failed to arrive home. Her parents, initially concerned but not alarmed, quickly realized something was wrong. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends were checked. Doors were searched. By nightfall, the worry escalated into fear, and the local police were notified. Detectives arrived at the scene methodically. They traced Millie's last known route, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed CCTV footage from local streets and shops. Every fragment of information was examined: a fleeting shadow on a camera frame, a car idling too long near a route, a passerby's memory of someone loitering. Nothing was conclusive, yet each detail added weight to the investigation. The community responded with quiet urgency. Volunteers walked streets, canvassed neighborhoods, and distributed flyers. The local media reported extensively, balancing concern with sensitivity. The family lived with a growing, unbearable uncertainty. Every knock at the door, every phone ring, carrying the potential for news that could never undo the night's events. As the investigation deepened, a grim reality emerged. Millie had been abducted, taken from the streets of her town in a way that left almost no immediate trace. Forensic teams reconstructed her movements from fragments. A footprint here, a scrap of clothing there, the trace of a presence that had passed too quickly to be seen. Detectives worked to map the timeline, establishing who might have observed her, who might have followed her, and what clues the perpetrator had left behind, however small. The case became a meticulous study in patience, pattern recognition, and the limits of certainty. Investigators pieced together leads, questioned suspects, and followed the faintest hints. Yet the crime seemed both random and targeted, a paradox that frustrated and haunted those seeking closure. The emotional toll was immense. Millie's family endured every day with a weight of uncertainty. The public, too, felt the unease, drawn into a story that was at once intimate and incomprehensible. The streets of Walton-on-Thames, familiar and once comforting, became a place of collective vigilance, a subtle awareness that even the ordinary could be shadowed by danger. Years later, the case would see resolution through the arrest and conviction of Levi Belfield, but the echoes of that night remain. CCTV footage, photographs, and forensic evidence provide a factual record, yet the human experience, the fear, the grief, the small, quiet details of a life interrupted, lingers in memory. Even today, the paths Millie walked are calm, lined with trees and quiet homes. Yet when dusk falls and the shadows lengthen across the streets, there is an unspoken remembrance, a silhouette of a girl carrying her school bag, footsteps fading into a night that would not welcome her home again. Next story: the disappearance of Brandy Hall, Florida, 2006. Night had already settled over Melbourne, Florida, on August 17, 2006, when Brandy Hall, a 32-year-old firefighter and mother of two, finished her shift. She stepped out into the warm, humid air, the kind that makes even the quietest evenings feel heavy, and headed toward her truck. Brandy was well known in the community. Tough, skilled, calm under pressure, she was the kind of firefighter others trusted instinctively. She should have been on her way home. Instead, she vanished into the darkness. Brandy's truck was later seen driving north, away from the fire station, the taillights fading into the night along rural roads fringed with pine trees and wide stretches of marshland. It was near midnight when a passerby noticed smoke rising near a retention pond off State Road 520 and called for help. When authorities arrived, they found Brandy's truck submerged in the water, nose down, with thick black smoke still curling upward from the engine compartment. Inside the cab, the interior looked strangely undisturbed. Her purse was missing. Her gear was missing. Brandy was gone. But what stood out most was what wasn't there: any sign of Brandy climbing out. Investigators pulled the truck from the water at sunrise. The sky was a pale wash of pink and blue as divers combed the pond, moving slowly through dark water clouded with silt. They found no footprints leading away from the shore, no drag marks, no discarded clothing. It was as if Brandy had stepped out of her truck and disappeared into the air. Her family told detectives she had been restless all week. There had been tension, legal troubles involving her husband, rumors of old charges resurfacing, worries she confided to friends in quiet conversations. She tried to shield her children from it, keeping her voice steady even when stress weighed heavily on her. But the night she vanished, something felt different. She left the fire station quickly, almost urgently, as if she needed to be somewhere the moment she walked out the door. Search teams gathered over the next few days. Firefighters, volunteers, deputies with dogs, divers combing ponds and canals. They moved through the thick brush of rural Brevard County, the grass crunching under their boots, the air buzzing with insects. Helicopters scanned the wetlands, their spotlights drifting across fields and water like pale moons. Nothing surfaced, no clothing, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only silence. Detectives reviewed security footage from nearby businesses, hoping for a glimpse of Brandy's truck before it entered the water. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and family members. They combed through phone records, bank statements, and messages. There were leads, but each one ended the same way, quietly, without resolution. Some investigators considered the possibility that Brandy staged her disappearance. Others argued the opposite, that she met with danger the moment she left the station. Her abandoned truck, half-burned and hidden in water, felt intentional, as though someone had tried to erase the path she took. Yet there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no definitive proof she had been harmed. And so the mystery grew deeper. As the weeks passed, the search softened into a lingering ache. Brandy's family kept her photo on kitchen counters, dashboard mirrors, bulletin boards, any place where her smile might catch the eye. Her fellow firefighters remembered her as someone who never hesitated to run into burning buildings, yet vanished on a night when she was supposed to be safe. Years later, investigators would occasionally revisit the case, flipping through pages of old notes, aerial maps, and timelines. Each detail remained where it had always been: the submerged truck, the missing gear, the unexplained fire, the stillness of that retention pond. But none of it moved the story forward. To this day, Brandy Hall has not been found. Sometimes, locals driving down State Road 520 at night glance toward the dark water where her truck was discovered. The surface looks calm now, reflecting streetlights and passing headlights. But beneath that quiet mirror lies the point where Brandy's trail went cold, a single place where certainty ends and mystery begins. Next story: the disappearance of Relisha Rudd, Washington, D.C., 2014. Washington, D.C., in March 2014, was waking slowly from the chill of winter. Snow patches clung to sidewalks, and the early morning streets hummed with commuters. In the shadows of the city's government buildings and row houses, life continued as usual. But one small girl's life was about to be consumed by a mystery that would grip the city for months. Relisha Rudd, 8 years old, lived with her mother in a shelter in the district. Life had been unstable, full of uncertainty, but Relisha was described by those who knew her as bright, spirited, and deeply caring. A child who, despite challenges, radiated warmth and intelligence. On the morning of March 1st, she left the shelter with her mother's permission, expecting to go to school. She never arrived. Relish's absence was first noticed when her teachers reported her missing after the morning roll call. The shelter staff contacted her mother, and panic began to ripple through the small community that knew the girl. What made the situation especially concerning was the person who had last been seen with her, Khalil Tatum, a janitor at the shelter who had developed a troubling interest in Relisha. Investigators quickly discovered that Tatum had been driving Relisha around the city, taking her to hotels and purchasing gifts, actions that seemed innocent on the surface but revealed deeper manipulation. Surveillance footage showed the pair entering and exiting the hotels, leaving a trail of evidence that would later prove crucial. Authorities issued alerts, canvassed the city, and conducted interviews with shelter staff, neighbors, and hotel employees. Each detail added urgency. Tatum had access to the girl. He was trusted by the shelter staff because of his employment, and yet his intentions were unknown. Relish's mother described her daughter as joyful and compliant, but also a child who obeyed authority figures without question. This made her vulnerable to someone patient and manipulative, someone like Tatum. Investigators examined phone records, tracking calls and texts. Hotel records were combed for timestamps, room numbers, and guest movements. Every lead painted a disturbing picture of calculated grooming and coercion. Days turned into weeks. Volunteers searched city streets, parks, abandoned lots, and the surrounding neighborhoods. Tips flooded in from citizens who thought they had glimpsed the girl, but each ended in frustration. The trail remained cold. Authorities eventually linked Tatum to multiple hotels and his own home, discovering evidence of Relish's presence in hidden corners, wrapped in blankets and photographed. Despite this, the girl herself could not be located. The case took a dark turn as police dug into Tatum's past. Financial records, prior conduct, and statements from acquaintances revealed a pattern of secrecy, evasion, and disturbing behavior. The more they uncovered, the more the reality became chilling. Relish's disappearance was not random. She had been targeted, isolated, and removed from the world she knew. Despite tireless investigation, she was never recovered. Her case remains open, a haunting reminder of vulnerability, manipulation, and the quiet dangers that can exist even in familiar environments. The community remembers her vividly, an 8-year-old girl whose light was stolen, leaving questions that have never been answered. Even today, when the streets of Washington, D.C. are quiet at night, the story of Relisha Rudd lingers in the corners of the city. Families, neighbors, and strangers alike remember a child who vanished, a man who manipulated trust, and a trail of unanswered questions that refuses to fade. Next story, the Long Island babysitter murders, Long Island, New York, 1960s. Long Island, New York, in the mid-1960s, was a place of quiet suburbs, tree-lined streets, and the slow rhythm of everyday life. Families settled into neat houses, children played in backyards, and the nights carried the soft hum of cicadas and distant traffic. Yet beneath this calm, a shadow was growing, one that would terrify the community and leave a lingering fear in its wake. It began with the disappearance of young girls who worked as babysitters. Teenagers, trusted by families to care for children while parents were away, suddenly vanished without a trace. Their routines had been ordinary, arriving at homes in the early evening, settling in with the children, and waiting for parents to return. But that night, the light from the living room lamp or the sound of the TV would be the last anyone ever saw of them. The first case shook the neighborhood to its core. A teenage babysitter, entrusted by a local family, was last seen walking down a quiet street, keys in hand, her evening just beginning. Hours later, the police were called. The girl was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle in the home, and no witnesses to her disappearance. Over the months, other cases followed the same pattern. The victims were all young, often in their mid to late teens, alone in homes where they were expected to be safe. Their disappearances were swift, and the scenes left behind offered no clues. Bedrooms untouched, doors locked, possessions in place. It was as if someone had erased their presence entirely. Authorities launched extensive investigations. Patrols increased in neighborhoods, and parents began insisting that teenagers never babysit alone. Detectives combed the streets for suspicious vehicles, questioned anyone who had seen the girls that evening, and interviewed neighbors. Surveillance, though rudimentary compared to modern standards, included reports from watchful residents who remembered unfamiliar cars lingering at odd hours. One thing became increasingly clear: the perpetrator was patient and methodical. He chose his victims carefully, often selecting homes that appeared quiet and isolated, homes that offered minimal opportunity for interference. He seemed to understand the routines of both the babysitters and the families, striking without warning, leaving little evidence behind. Despite tireless efforts, the crimes remained largely unsolved. Law enforcement explored dozens of leads: possible suspects with prior records, individuals familiar with the neighborhoods, transient workers who might blend unnoticed among the residents. Interviews were conducted over months, but each lead eventually cooled, leaving behind frustration and fear. The parents of the missing girls were left in a state of constant anxiety. Neighborhoods once trusted became tense. Teenagers walked streets with heightened awareness, keys clutched tightly, eyes scanning for shadows. Families installed new locks and alarms, but the psychological impact lingered far longer than the physical measures could address. Over time, the series of babysitter murders came to symbolize a chilling reality. Even in suburban tranquility, danger could exist silently, striking seemingly at random and vanishing just as quietly. The homes that were supposed to be havens became scenes of uncertainty, and the streets that were once ordinary carried an undercurrent of fear. Though decades have passed, the Long Island babysitter murders remain a haunting chapter in the region's history, a reminder of the vulnerability of youth, the patience of a predator, and the enduring questions left behind when someone disappears without a trace. Next story: the disappearance of Asha Degree, Shelby, North Carolina, 2000. The night of February 14, 2000, was unusually cold in Shelby, North Carolina. A light dusting of snow had fallen over the quiet streets, and the town seemed wrapped in stillness. Inside her home, Asha Degree, a 9-year-old girl described by teachers and neighbors as bright, curious, and independent, was awake late, unusually so for a child of her age. Her parents had gone to bed after their evening routines, unaware that the night would not unfold as expected. Asha had packed a small bag, carefully, as if preparing for a journey she could not yet explain. At some point in the early hours, she quietly left her home, slipping out into the darkness while the household slept. By 4 a.m., Asha was spotted walking along Highway 18, her small figure moving with determination against the cold. Witnesses would later describe her as carrying a book bag and appearing focused, almost purposeful, but the reason for her journey remained a mystery. Authorities were alerted quickly after her parents discovered she was missing. A massive search ensued, involving local police, firefighters, volunteers, and K-9 units. The early morning hours saw teams combing roadsides, wooded areas, and nearby neighborhoods. Helicopters scanned the landscape, their spotlights cutting through the darkness, but Asha was nowhere to be found. The investigation uncovered puzzling details. Asha's home showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance, suggesting she had left willingly. Yet the distance she traveled and the conditions she faced, cold, dark, and desolate, made the disappearance perplexing. Experts noted that children rarely undertake such journeys alone, raising immediate concern about the presence of someone who may have influenced or followed her. Neighbors reported seeing a small car on the road that night, though details were scarce and inconclusive. Each lead was pursued, with detectives interviewing anyone who might have seen a child moving along the highways or trails leading out of town. Search efforts expanded over the following days, encompassing hundreds of volunteers and multiple agencies. Maps of the area were scrutinized for possible escape routes or hiding places. Nearby forests and abandoned structures were checked repeatedly, but no trace of Asha was found. Items of personal significance, like her backpack and clothing, were never recovered. Media coverage spread rapidly, and the story gained national attention. Public awareness campaigns urged anyone with information to come forward. Despite this, the trail remained cold. Experts debated whether Asha had been abducted, whether she had wandered off and met with misfortune, or whether a combination of circumstances had led to her vanishing. Over time, the case became one of the most haunting, unsolved disappearances in North Carolina history. Investigators revisited it repeatedly, analyzing old evidence with new technology, exploring digital records, and re-interviewing witnesses. Yet the answer remained elusive. For the family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Each day, without resolution, was a quiet torment. A life interrupted, a daughter missing, a question that could not be answered. The town of Shelby, once calm and familiar, carried the weight of that night indefinitely, a reminder of vulnerability even in the smallest communities. Even now, when the roads near Highway 18 are quiet at night, some locals recall the image of a small girl walking alone, her resolve unwavering, her fate unknown, a mystery that refuses to fade. Next story, the Delphi Murders, Indiana, 2017. The paths along Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana, were quiet that February morning. Winter had left the trees bare, their skeletal branches stretching against a pale gray sky. Snow lingered in patches, and the air was crisp and biting. Two 13-year-old girls, Abby Williams and Libby German, set out for a walk that would never end as expected. The girls were ordinary teenagers with bright personalities and close friendship. They had a routine, a small adventure to enjoy the woods near their hometown, a place they had walked before. That day, they recorded moments on their phones, videos and images meant to capture memories of friendship and fun. But on the bridge overlooking the creek, a shadow appeared, someone watching, someone waiting. That figure would become the focus of a nationwide search and the face of a haunting crime that gripped the country. Investigators later revealed chilling details. The girls had seen their attacker approaching. In a final act of awareness, Libby managed to capture a short video on her phone, while Abby's phone captured audio. The recordings would later become crucial evidence, the only direct link to the unknown assailant. The girls' disappearance was noticed within hours. Family members retraced the trail, calling for them, their voices echoing through the cold trees. Neighbors joined in, police arrived, and a massive search was launched. Helicopters hovered overhead, dogs combed the area, and volunteers moved carefully through the frozen underbrush. But the girls were gone. The local community was shaken. Delphi, a small town where everyone knew each other, had always felt safe. The incident shattered that sense of security. Parents held their children closer, and the trails where children had once roamed freely became spaces of caution and unease. Evidence recovered at the scene gave investigators a starting point. Items belonging to the girls, including backpacks and phones, were found abandoned along the trail. The video and audio captured the presence of the killer, a distorted voice, a figure in the distance, enough to allow law enforcement to begin profiling. Every detail was analyzed: height, gait, voice inflection, clothing, timing. The investigation spread beyond Delphi. Federal agencies, forensic experts, and criminal profilers joined local authorities. The case gained national attention, with tip lines flooded with leads and potential sightings. But the trail was treacherous, filled with uncertainty and dead ends. Despite exhaustive efforts, the murderer remained unidentified for years. The case became a puzzle of patience, technology, and human observation. Every new lead offered hope. Every confirmed tip reignited attention. But the solution remained just out of reach. For the families of Abby and Libby, the pain was constant. Every anniversary, every day, reminded them of the moment the girls vanished. Community vigils and social media campaigns kept their memory alive, a steady beacon of light amidst the darkness of uncertainty. The Delphi murders are remembered not only for their brutality, but for the resilience of the families, the dedication of investigators, and the way a small town grappled with a crime that could have happened anywhere. The trails remain quiet, the bridge still standing, but the memory of that day lingers, a sobering reminder of innocence disrupted, lives stolen, and questions that may never be fully answered. Next story, the disappearance of Susie Lamplugh, Fulham, London, 1986. Night fell quietly over Fulham, London, on the evening of July 28, 1986. The streets were dimly lit, the orange glow of the lamps reflecting on wet pavements from an earlier drizzle. The faint hum of distant traffic filled the air, punctuated by the occasional footsteps echoing off the brick-lined alleyways. It was the sort of summer night that felt warm yet restless, ordinary, yet carrying a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. Susie Lamplugh, a 25-year-old estate agent, had spent her afternoon meeting clients and preparing for upcoming property viewings. Known for her professionalism, charm, and meticulous nature, Susie had a routine she followed carefully. That day, she had agreed to meet a new client at a house on Shirley Road, a narrow street lined with terraced houses, some with faintly glowing curtains hinting at the quiet lives inside. She left her office around 1:30 p.m., carrying a small purse and a set of property documents tucked neatly under her arm. Witnesses later recalled seeing her walk down the street, her posture confident, her stride deliberate, unaware that the meeting she had planned would become the last anyone ever saw her alive. The client she was due to meet was described as a tall man, dressed neatly, with dark hair and an unassuming demeanor. Their interaction was meant to be ordinary, professional, and brief. Yet something about the arrangement left subtle traces of unease, though at the time, no one could articulate why. By mid-afternoon, Susie had not returned to her office. Concern grew as colleagues called her mobile and found it unanswered. Hours passed, and the streets she had traversed appeared calm, silent, yet empty in a way that felt unnatural. Susie's absence transformed from an inconvenience into a growing worry. Police were contacted that evening, and a search was quickly organized. Officers canvassed Shirley Road and surrounding areas, knocking on doors, speaking to neighbors, and reviewing the path she might have taken. The area was dense with small streets, each lined with brick houses, narrow gardens, and fences that allowed little visibility from one property to the next. Investigators traced her last known movements meticulously. They examined her appointments, notes, and phone calls. They checked public transport schedules, taxis, and traffic cameras were available. Every detail was scrutinized, a lost document, a misplaced phone call, a fleeting shadow in a doorway. But the trail ran cold, vanishing into the quiet streets of Fulham. Witness statements describe a man seen speaking to a woman matching Susie's description that afternoon. His gait was calm, measured, and ordinary. No one perceived him as a threat at the time. Later analysis would suggest that subtle cues, the way he gestured, how he led Susie to the parked car, hinted at premeditation, though these remained details only visible in hindsight. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives reviewed her client lists, business interactions, and personal contacts. They examined every potential avenue: work connections, casual acquaintances, past relationships. Forensic teams scoured the area for trace evidence, fingerprints, and fibers. Dogs searched gardens, back alleys, and the nearby Thames embankment. But nothing conclusive was found. Susie's family, friends, and colleagues were plunged into uncertainty. Her parents were frantic, retracing every day of her life, calling offices, checking hospitals, asking anyone who might have seen her. The community rallied, posting flyers, distributing photographs, and organizing volunteer searches. Yet the question lingered, persistent and heavy. Where had she gone? Over the weeks and months, police examined possible motives and suspects. Some leads suggested opportunistic abduction. Others hinted at someone known to her professionally. Despite tireless investigation, no definitive answers emerged. The streets Susie had walked became markers of absence, ordinary brick facades hiding an invisible thread of uncertainty. The case captured national attention. Newspapers printed her photo on front pages. Television news reports recounted her disappearance in detail, and public appeals were broadcast widely. Yet each new tip led only to partial avenues. A sighting in a car park, a shadow glimpsed near a quiet alley, an anonymous call. Each possibility carried hope, then faded into silence. Even decades later, the case remains unsolved. Experts, investigators, and amateur sleuths continue to study the evidence. The notes, the route she took, the man she met that afternoon. There is an uneasy tension in the absence of closure, a quiet reminder that in the midst of a bustling city, someone can vanish entirely, leaving only the memory of a routine, a walk, and a moment forever frozen in time. Sometimes, residents of Fulham recall seeing shadows along Shirley Road in the fading light, or the faint sound of footsteps echoing just a fraction too long down narrow lanes. There is a quietness there now, a stillness in the air that whispers of a life interrupted. Susie Lampless' disappearance remains a delicate, haunting echo, a reminder of vulnerability, meticulous planning, and a question that refuses to be answered. Next story. The White House Farm Murders, Tolleshunt Darcy, Essex, 1985. The village of Tolleshunt Darcy, Essex, was quiet on the evening of August 6, 1985. The late summer sun had dipped behind low clouds, casting long shadows across narrow lanes and modest cottages. Birds had settled for the night, their calls replaced by the distant hum of traffic along country roads. The White House farm, an isolated brick property set back from the main road, stood almost imperceptibly in the dim light, a home that to neighbors appeared peaceful and unremarkable. Inside the farmhouse, life continued in a rhythm familiar to those who lived there. Beryl and June Sturgis, mother and sister, were winding down for the evening. Their days had been filled with ordinary tasks: cooking, cleaning, tending to the gardens, and managing the quiet routines of home life. The family's eldest son, Jeremy, known as Jim, had a life punctuated by responsibility and care for those around him. Neighbors recalled seeing him maintaining the grounds, tending animals, and helping with farm duties. Yet, as darkness crept across the fields, an atmosphere of quiet tension began to accumulate. At some point that evening, someone entered the farmhouse. The house was locked, doors and windows secured as usual. But inside, the presence of a single figure would transform the ordinary into something sinister. By morning, the world outside the farmhouse would appear unchanged. The same lanes, the same hedgerows, the same mist hovering over the fields. But inside, life had been extinguished. Beryl and June Sturgis and Jeremy's fiancée, Joanna Hall, were found dead. The scene was jarring yet methodical. The victims were in their beds, each struck by a shotgun. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Only the unsettling stillness of a house where routine had been violently interrupted. Detectives arrived quickly. They examined the farmhouse in meticulous detail. Shotgun patterns, angles, and distances were analyzed. Footprints, fingerprints, and subtle disturbances in the household were cataloged. The bodies had been positioned as though to suggest a particular sequence, a chilling narrative captured by the placement of each victim. Investigators initially faced the impossible question: who could have committed such a crime, and why? Neighbors were interviewed, backgrounds were checked, alibis scrutinized. The family's life was pieced together hour by hour, day by day, with each detail cross-referenced against every witness account. Suspicion first touched on outsiders, burglars, strangers, anyone with potential grievance. But the more detectives learned, the more the circle of suspicion tightened. Motive, it seemed, could be found much closer to home. Examination of family relationships, financial arrangements, and previous disputes revealed tension beneath the surface of the quiet farmhouse. Forensic evidence, though limited by the standards of the mid-1980s, became crucial. The police traced shell casings, shotgun residue, and ballistic details to understand the sequence of events. Timing was reconstructed based on neighbor observations, vehicle movements, and auditory accounts of gunfire in the night. Each piece added to the puzzle, revealing a methodical and deliberate act, rather than a spontaneous crime of passion. When attention turned inward, the investigators were met with the most chilling reality. The murders had been committed by Jeremy Bamber, the son who had appeared responsible, caring, and dependable. The methodical nature of the crime, the timing, and the apparent normalcy before and after the event painted a portrait of calculation. Bamber's ability to blend routine with malevolence left the community reeling. The trial captivated the nation. Testimony detailed the planning, the relationships, and the deception that allowed Bamber to maintain a facade of normality. Prosecutors laid out evidence of premeditation, the meticulous orchestration of a crime within the heart of a family, and the attempt to mislead authorities through staged burglary. The conviction followed, cementing the case as one of Britain's most notorious family murders. Yet the echoes of that night remain palpable. Villagers spoke of the way the farmhouse seemed to settle afterward. The creaking floorboards, the empty rooms, the quiet fields where children once played. Even now, the story of the White House farm murders lingers in Essex. The house stands as a somber reminder of trust broken, of routine shattered, and of the darkness that can exist behind familiar walls. Neighbors still recall the summer night when shadows stretched across the fields, hiding a tragedy that would unfold silently, methodically, and irrevocably. Next story, Rachel Nichol, Wimbledon Common Murder, London, 1992. Night settled over Wimbledon Common, London, in the early hours of July 15, 1992. The summer air was cool, carrying the scent of damp grass and faint smoke from distant chimneys. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting shifting shadows across the pathways and heathland. The common, usually filled with daytime walkers and dog owners, now lay silent, vast, and empty. Rachel Nichol, a 23-year-old young mother, had spent her day with her son, enjoying the routine of a quiet London life. She was known for her warmth, her easy smile, and her attentive care for her toddler. That evening, after a day out with her child, she made her way to Wimbledon Common, a place she often visited for walking and relaxation. It was a familiar route, comfortable and ordinary, one where she could feel a measure of solitude even within the city. As Rachel walked, the light dimmed, and the common grew darker with each passing minute. Her pace was steady, her steps confident yet relaxed. She paused occasionally to adjust her bag, to soothe her child, and to glance around. The rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind in the trees, and the distant hum of traffic blending into the background. Unbeknownst to her, a presence was nearby. A man, moving with quiet deliberation, observed from the shadows. His steps were light, calculated. He wore muted clothing, blending with the darkness, his gaze fixed, patient, waiting for the right moment. The encounter itself lasted mere moments, but it would leave an indelible mark on the city, the community, and those who knew Rachel. The attack was swift, brutal, and sudden. Rachel Nichol was struck repeatedly, an act of violence that shocked London in its severity and senselessness. In the quiet hours of the early morning, the common became a scene of tragedy, hidden within ordinary greenery. When her body was discovered later that morning, the area was cordoned off quickly. Forensic teams moved methodically, documenting every detail: the position of her belongings, the angle of the attack, traces of fibers, and footprints pressed into the soft earth. Evidence was carefully collected, preserved, and analyzed, each piece a potential thread leading to the identity of her killer. The investigation that followed was vast and complex. Detectives interviewed witnesses, neighbors, and anyone who had been near the common that day. They reviewed patrol schedules, public transport, and CCTV footage were available. Every possible lead was followed meticulously. Specialists examined the scene for psychological patterns, attempting to understand the motive behind such a seemingly random act. Families and friends of Rachel were plunged into grief. Her son, too young to comprehend fully, was left without his mother's presence. Her parents described an unending emptiness, a quiet that filled their home with unanswered questions. The public, too, was captivated by the story. Newspapers and television recounted the tragedy, each retelling amplifying the sense of loss, yet offering no immediate resolution. Years of investigation yielded some answers, but also controversy. Early suspects were scrutinized, some accused falsely, while true leads were carefully pursued. The nature of the crime, the timing, and the behavior of the perpetrator highlighted both randomness and sinister calculation. Even decades later, Wimbledon Common holds the memory of that day. Residents recall the eeriness of the paths, the way the trees whisper in the wind, and the shadowed stretches where the attack took place. Rachel Nichols' story remains a poignant reminder of vulnerability, of innocence interrupted, and of the persistence of grief and unanswered questions. The Common is tranquil now, ordinary in appearance, yet for those who remember, it carries the quiet echo of a summer morning forever altered, footsteps fading into memory, and the haunting reminder that even familiar places can conceal darkness. Next story, The Murder of Joanna Yates, Bristol, 2010. Night fell softly over Bristol, England, on December 17, 2010. The city streets were quiet, glistening from a light winter rain, reflecting the glow of street lamps. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint smell of damp brick and exhaust from distant traffic. Houses nestled closely together, their windows darkened, curtains drawn against the long night. The city appeared calm, ordinary, and yet within that stillness, a young life was about to be forever altered. Joanna Yates, 25, was known for her warmth, her meticulous nature, and the careful balance she maintained between work, friends, and family. That evening, she left her apartment after a small gathering with colleagues, carrying her handbag close, her coat buttoned against the chill. She took her usual route along quiet streets, familiar paths she had walked countless times, comfortable in the rhythm of her surroundings. Somewhere nearby, a presence moved with intention. Footsteps echoed softly on wet pavement, a coat brushing against itself, a figure observing, waiting, unremarkable at first glance. They weren't rushed. They weren't careless. Every movement was measured, deliberate, as if rehearsed in advance. The ordinary streets, so familiar to Joanna, now became part of an unseen choreography, the quiet backdrop to an event that would shatter lives. Joanna's disappearance was noticed when she failed to arrive home. Friends and colleagues began calling, sending messages, and searching the familiar streets. Her apartment, usually tidy and welcoming, remained empty. The following hours became a search, a careful examination of CCTV footage from nearby shops and streets, interviews with neighbors, and a reconstruction of her last known movements. Every fragment of observation mattered. A silhouette in a doorway, a passing car, a discarded item on the wet pavement. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a grim pattern emerged. Joanna had been attacked while walking through streets she thought she knew. The assault was swift, leaving few immediate clues. Forensic teams meticulously documented the scene, collecting trace evidence, fibers, and soil samples. Every small detail, the angle of her belongings, the disturbances in the environment, became part of the puzzle. The community, shocked and fearful, responded quietly but urgently. Volunteers searched, doors were knocked upon, and local media covered the story with care. Families spoke of vigilance, of checking on children and neighbors, of the fragility of routine. Joanna's family endured unimaginable uncertainty, each hour stretching longer than the last, their grief amplified by the lack of immediate answers. The investigation eventually identified Christopher Jeffries, Joanna's landlord, as a person of interest due to circumstantial evidence, though he was later fully exonerated. The true perpetrator, Vincent Tabak, was identified through detailed forensic analysis, DNA evidence, computer investigations, and a painstaking review of movements and behaviors. Tabak's meticulous, calculated approach mirrored the quiet, ordinary settings of the city streets, a stark reminder of how seemingly familiar spaces could conceal darkness. The trial that followed revealed the meticulous planning, the calculated approach, and the cold disregard for life. Evidence showed how Tabak had observed, waited, and acted with precision, taking advantage of a predictable routine. The case became a study in how careful observation, persistence, and forensic science could uncover truth from chaos. Even after the conviction, Bristol retained an echo of the event. Streets, once walked without thought, were now passed with caution, with awareness of the unseen. The city's calm persisted, but residents remembered the ordinary winter evening transformed into a scene of tragedy. The image of Joanna, her coat buttoned, her handbag secure, footsteps fading into the night, remained a quiet, haunting memory, lingering on pathways, across pavements, and in the minds of those who walked the same streets. Next story, the disappearance of Claudia Kerwin, Australia, 2017. Night settled quietly over a suburban neighborhood in Australia in 2017. The streets were lined with familiar houses, their windows dark, the occasional porch light casting long shadows across the pavement. A soft breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus and damp grass, and distant dogs barked in intervals, punctuating the stillness. By late evening, the suburb felt suspended in calm, as if the world were holding its breath. Claudia Kerwin, a 25-year-old woman, was known for her warmth, her quiet determination, and her attentive nature toward friends and family. That evening, she had returned home after work, completing her usual routines, preparing dinner, checking messages, and making small plans for the following day. Her movements were deliberate, familiar, and ordinary, the kind of evening that passes without incident until it does. Somewhere nearby, an observer moved with care. Shadows shifted along fences and under streetlights. Steps were soft, measured, and precise. The figure was deliberate but unobtrusive, blending into the quiet neighborhood. They were patient. They were waiting. Their presence left no immediate alarm, no disturbance beyond what could be mistaken for routine activity in the suburb. By the next morning, Claudia was missing. Her absence was first noticed by close friends and neighbors. A missed check-in, an unanswered message, a front door left closed when it should have opened. Concern grew quickly, and police were notified. Investigators arrived to meticulously examine her home and surroundings. Each detail was logged. Doors and windows checked for forced entry, footprints or tire tracks inspected, digital devices examined for clues. Every small trace was critical to understanding the sequence of events. The investigation revealed only fragments. CCTV footage showed nothing definitive. Witnesses recalled seeing a figure moving in the area, but descriptions varied. There were cars parked temporarily, shadows in doorways, footsteps that led nowhere. Detectives reconstructed Claudia's movements, tracing her routines, her errands, her connections, but every lead seemed to dissolve before it could provide a full picture. Her family endured days of uncertainty that stretched into weeks. Friends organized searches, volunteers walked streets and parklands, and social media amplified the concern, each post a plea for information. The quiet suburb, usually familiar and safe, became a space of vigilance, its streets observed with newfound care, its nights longer and more tense. The case remained unresolved. Investigators continued to review evidence, to follow leads both new and old. Questions lingered. Who had followed her? Where had she gone? And why had the ordinary evening ended with her disappearance? Claudia's story left a haunting imprint. The sense that someone could vanish from the world quietly, leaving little trace except memory, evidence of life interrupted. Even now, the neighborhood retains a subtle unease. The streets seem quieter than they once were, the occasional rustle of leaves or distant footsteps reminding those who walk them of a day that ended in absence. Claudia's disappearance remains a quiet, persistent mystery, a reminder that even ordinary places and ordinary routines can be touched by the extraordinary and by loss. Next story, The disappearance of Emma Philippoff, Victoria, British Columbia, 2012. Night settled over Victoria, British Columbia, in the early hours of November 28, 2012. The city was quiet, fog curling along the harbor and muffling the distant hum of traffic. Street lights cast halos in the mist, and the faint clatter of waves against docks whispered through the air. Side streets were nearly empty, homes dark, the occasional flicker of a television through a window, the only sign of life. The calm was profound, almost expectant, as if the city itself sensed a story quietly unfolding. Emma Philippoff, 25, had spent the evening moving through the ordinary rhythms of her life. A student and aspiring artist, she had been organizing her workspace, arranging papers, and tending to the small routines that gave shape to her days. That night, she carried a modest backpack, its straps worn but familiar. She walked the streets of downtown Victoria, taking the short, habitual paths that had always guided her safely home. Somewhere in the shadows, someone moved with patience. Footsteps echoed softly against wet pavement. A figure paused at corners, watching. They weren't rushed. They weren't nervous. Their movements were deliberate, measured, almost as if rehearsed. The ordinary streets of Victoria became an unnoticed stage for actions that would remain shrouded in mystery. Emma was last seen near Fan Tan Alley, the narrow, brick-lined passageway that twisted through the city's historic quarter. It was a quiet space at night, often empty, lit by a few hanging lanterns. Witnesses later described seeing her walking alone, her pace unhurried, her coat pulled close against the chill. Small details, a glint of her bag's zipper, the echo of her steps against the brick walls, are the last fragments of her presence. By morning, Emma had vanished. Concern grew quickly when she failed to return to her home, leaving behind personal belongings and signs of an interrupted routine. Her family, alarmed and anxious, contacted local authorities. Police began a methodical investigation, combing streets, checking CCTV footage, and interviewing anyone who might have seen her. Each small clue was cataloged. A discarded coffee cup, a footprint in damp brick, a shadow glimpsed from a window. The investigation uncovered fleeting glimpses, but no definitive answers. CCTV footage was grainy and incomplete, showing only parts of a street she walked. Witnesses offered varying descriptions. A man standing across the alley, a vehicle idling too long, a figure moving just out of reach of the cameras. Investigators traced her steps hour by hour, reconstructing her movements, her decisions, and the places she lingered. Yet, each line of inquiry ended with uncertainty. The community responded with quiet determination. Volunteers combed alleys, parks, and waterfronts. Flyers were distributed, social media campaigns launched, and local residents shared any small observation that might help. Emma's family endured the slow, heavy anxiety of the unknown. Every knock at the door, every phone call, every passerby became a question. Could this be news? Could this be a sign? As days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. Theories circulated. Did she leave voluntarily, or was she intercepted? Was there someone observing her, tracking her familiar paths? Forensics provided few answers. Objects recovered were minor and inconclusive. Digital traces offered fragments. Her phone last pinging in one area. Her online activity a fading echo. Yet amidst the unresolved questions, certain images remained vivid. The narrow alley she had walked. The soft glimmer of streetlights on wet bricks. The sound of footsteps in a quiet, waiting city. Emma's disappearance became an unspoken presence in Victoria, a story layered over familiar streets, casting shadows on ordinary nights. Even now, those who know the alleys say the fog seems heavier, the streets quieter, as if holding space for a presence that is no longer there. The air carries the memory of Emma's footsteps, deliberate, cautious, and fading. A reminder that ordinary nights can conceal the extraordinary, and that some disappearances leave traces that linger in silence. Next story. The murder of Anita Cobby, Australia, 1986. The city of Blacktown, New South Wales, was quiet on the night of February 2nd, 1986, though the stillness was deceptive. Streetlights cast long pools of yellow across asphalt, the occasional breeze stirring litter along sidewalks. Shops were shuttered, houses dark except for the occasional glow of a television. It was late, but life hadn't entirely stopped. The hum of distant traffic, the faint barking of a dog, the periodic clatter of a bottle in an alleyway marked a world unaware of the violence about to unfold. Anita Cobby, 26, was a nurse, conscientious and driven, known for her quiet professionalism and thoughtful nature. She had spent the day at work, caring for patients, completing her shift, then returning home to the modest apartment she shared with friends. Her routine was meticulous. Check schedules, prepare meals, call her family, and wind down with reading or music. That evening, she had returned from a friend's place, her small handbag swinging lightly at her side, keys in hand, and her mind on the mundane, bills, errands, the next day's plans. She walked along familiar streets, the soles of her shoes muffled against the asphalt. Shadows stretched across walls and parked cars, shifting slowly with the sway of her movement. For anyone watching from a distance, it was ordinary, a young woman heading home. But somewhere, out of sight, others were moving with purpose. They weren't rushed. They weren't nervous. They moved deliberately, shadows among shadows, intersecting with her path at precisely the wrong time. Anita never returned home. The following day, her absence was noticed. Police quickly identified her as the missing woman. Investigators soon discovered evidence that indicated a violent abduction. Trace fibers, tire tracks, and witness reports suggested she had been forcibly taken from the street. Further investigation revealed a crime of horrifying brutality. Anita had been sexually assaulted and murdered, her body left in a remote location. The manner of her death shocked the nation. Yet the case was quickly pursued with precision and rigor. Detectives traced leads to a group of men, Michael Murphy, William Vandenberg, and two others, who had a history of violent offenses. One by one, investigators examined alibis, interrogated witnesses, and reviewed connections to Blacktown on the night of Anita's disappearance. Forensic evidence, including fiber analysis and witness testimony, slowly tied the men to the crime. The investigation was meticulous, patient, and methodical, unspooling a series of events that had intersected tragically with Anita's ordinary path home. The arrests brought clarity, though the horror of the crime remained vivid. Murphy, Vandenberg, and the other two were charged with murder and sexual assault. Court proceedings revealed the premeditated nature of the attack. Anita had been targeted, abducted, and killed to silence her and conceal the assault. Evidence included witness statements, forensic traces, and confessions. During the trial, the sheer cruelty of the crime was laid bare. The defendant's lack of remorse noted repeatedly by prosecutors and witnesses alike. All four men were convicted. Sentences were severe, reflecting both the brutality and deliberate planning of the crime. The trial brought a measure of justice. Yet for Blacktown and for Anita's family, the quiet of that night remained heavy with absence. Ordinary streets, once walked without thought, seemed to retain the echo of what had happened. A handbag left unattended, footsteps on asphalt, the flicker of a distant streetlight, each carrying the memory of a life cut short. Anita Cobby's story is remembered not just for the crime itself, but for the intersection of ordinary life with deliberate malice. Her name became a symbol of vigilance, of the meticulous work of investigators, and of the enduring impact a single violent act can have on a community. Even decades later, Blacktown carries the quiet weight of that February night, a reminder that ordinary paths can, without warning, become profoundly dark. Next story, the murder of Lauren Burke, Auburn, Alabama, 2008. Auburn, Alabama, in October 2008, was calm and quiet, its college town streets filled with the usual rhythm of students moving between classes, dormitories, and campus activities. Night descended gently over the town, leaving the hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze. It was a world that seemed ordinary, even safe. Yet, on this evening, ordinary life would collide with violence. Lauren Burke, 21, was a student at Auburn University, known for her intelligence, dedication, and friendly presence. She moved through campus with ease, attending classes, helping friends, and participating in extracurricular activities. That evening, Lauren had spent time at campus events, chatting with peers, laughing, and unwinding from her studies. Later, she returned to her apartment complex, walking familiar paths along streets lined with dorms and modest townhouses. Her routine was predictable, but it made her vulnerable in ways she could not have foreseen. When Lauren failed to return home and misscheduled commitments the following day, concern grew immediately. Friends called, roommates checked the apartment, and campus security was alerted. Local law enforcement joined the search, combing the neighborhood, checking vehicles, and speaking with anyone who might have seen her that night. Initial interviews revealed little, but the sense of urgency escalated quickly. Investigators soon uncovered evidence of a horrifying truth. Lauren had been abducted and murdered, the crime carried out by a man familiar to the Auburn community, a fellow student named Demario Atwater. He exploited proximity and trust, following Lauren, striking when the opportunity presented itself. Forensic evidence and witness accounts would later reveal that she had been attacked outside her apartment, transported, and killed in a manner both sudden and deliberate. The investigation was meticulous. Authorities traced her steps using surveillance cameras, interviewed dozens of peers, and reconstructed digital records. Tire tracks and footprints, clothing fibers, and traces of DNA all pointed toward Atwater. Detectives pieced together the night's events slowly, carefully, methodically. They established that he had planned the abduction, observed her routines, and committed the crime with intent and premeditation. The arrest of Atwater brought clarity, though it could not undo the tragedy. During his trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive narrative, eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and a timeline of Lauren's final hours. The court heard how he had lured her, abducted her, and committed the murder in a remote location before leaving her body behind. Each detail, though grim, contributed to a larger understanding of the calculated nature of the crime. Atwater was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The legal process offered a form of resolution, though the emotional impact on Lauren's family, friends, and the Auburn community remained profound. Vigils were held, memorials erected, and conversations about safety on campus intensified. Dormitories, sidewalks, and quiet streets became reminders of both vulnerability and vigilance. Lauren Burke's story, while tragic, became a point of reflection for Auburn University. Campus protocols were reviewed, awareness campaigns initiated, and security measures strengthened. Yet, the memory of her life, full of promise, energy, and connection, persisted alongside the memory of the crime. Even years later, the streets she walked carry the echo of her footsteps, a quiet reminder of a life interrupted, and the importance of attentiveness, care, and justice. Our next story takes place in Texas in the early 1980s. By then, Marguerite Oswald was an old woman living in a small house in Fort Worth, tucked away behind a row of elm trees that leaned toward the street as if eavesdropping. She had thinning hair, a tired posture, and the unmistakable edge of someone who had lived her entire life under suspicion. She was not famous, but her name carried a shadow: Oswald. She was the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President John F. Kennedy. For nearly 2 decades, Marguerite had lived in that narrow strip between curiosity and isolation. She granted occasional interviews to reporters, sometimes charging small fees, her voice wavering between pride and resentment. She spoke about her son with the conviction of someone who had rewritten the story in her mind many times, that he was innocent, that there were things people didn't understand, that her family had been destroyed by forces far larger than themselves. Neighbors rarely spoke to her. They described her as odd but harmless, a woman who sometimes walked to the corner store in the same worn overcoat, who carried herself like she was always halfway through a conversation with someone no one else could see. Her mailbox often overflowed with letters, some sympathetic, some hateful. She read all of them. And then, one morning in March 1981, she didn't answer her door. It was the mail carrier who noticed first. The envelopes piling up, the newspapers left untouched on her porch. After 3 days, police were called to perform a welfare check. When they entered the house, they found Marguerite Oswald lying on the living room floor, half covered by a faded blanket. The television was still on, volume low, playing a rerun of a 1970s crime show. At first, officers assumed she had died of natural causes. She was 74 years old and had been in declining health. But something about the scene didn't sit right. There were overturned papers near the couch, a phone off the hook, and an open envelope on a coffee table addressed to a Dallas post office box. One investigators later discovered didn't exist. Her body was sent for autopsy. The medical examiner noted bruising on her wrists and a fracture at the base of her skull. The official cause of death, blunt force trauma. Marguerite Oswald had been murdered. Detectives from a Fort Worth police department quickly descended on the small property. The crime scene offered almost nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to her, and no valuables missing. The wallet on her nightstand still contained $27. Her old black and white photos of her son Lee as a child, of her other sons Robert and John, were untouched. The only item that seemed out of place was a small notebook lying face down near her recliner, pages torn out from the middle. Investigators interviewed her surviving son, Robert Oswald, who lived just outside Dallas. He told them he hadn't spoken to his mother in several months. Their relationship had long been strained. Marguerite had grown increasingly paranoid in her later years, convinced she was being watched, followed, listened to. Neighbors confirmed hearing her talk about strange phone calls at night. One remembered her standing in her front yard a few weeks before her death, arguing with an unseen person, or perhaps to herself, saying, "You can't erase me. I was his mother." Detectives initially suspected a break-in gone wrong, but nothing fit the pattern. There were no prime marks on the doors, no ransacking, no signs of robbery. The medical examiner placed her time of death sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight, a window when the street would have been quiet, porch lights dimmed, and the sound of cars fading toward the highway. The television had been tuned to Channel 4, a local affiliate that aired reruns of Columbo at that hour. It played quietly through the night, flickering across the walls of her small living room, casting faint light over the armchair where she had spent most evenings. Investigators dug into her final weeks. Marguerite had been corresponding with several people across the country: amateur historians, conspiracy theorists, and those still obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. She'd become a minor figure in their circles, sometimes exchanging long letters about her son's real story. One man from Louisiana claimed she had promised to mail him new documents proving the second gunman theory. Another said she'd recently received threatening calls telling her to stop digging. Police traced the calls, but found nothing. The numbers have been dialed from payphones across multiple states: Louisiana, Arkansas, even California. None led anywhere. Still, they noticed something unusual. In her kitchen, taped to the inside of a cupboard, was a hand-drawn map. It showed several U.S. cities connected by lines and arrows, ending in Dallas. Next to it, in her small, slanted handwriting, were the words, "He didn't do it alone." The media caught the scent almost immediately. Mother of JFK assassin found dead in Fort Worth home. For a few days, the headlines reignited old ghosts. News vans parked on her quiet street, and strangers gathered outside her fence, holding cameras and microphones. Detectives had to push through the noise. They released no details about the manner of her death at first, only that it was being treated as suspicious. Rumors spread quickly, some claiming she had been silenced by government agents, others saying she'd known too much. Inside the department, the lead detective, Harold Hal Peterson, privately admitted to colleagues that the case felt off. There was something too neat about it. A crime scene that said everything and nothing at once. One clue stood out. In Marguerite's bedroom, officers found an unmarked envelope tucked inside a photo album. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph showing a woman, possibly Marguerite, standing in front of a motel somewhere along Route 67. In the background, barely visible, was a blue sedan. The date on the back of the photo, February 14th, 1981, 5 weeks before her death. No one could identify the location. They traced every motel along that stretch of road, but found no matching sign or building. The photo was faded, grainy, and oddly composed, like it had been taken without the subject's awareness. The investigation dragged on through the summer. With no suspects, no witnesses, and no apparent motive, public attention faded. By fall, the case was reassigned twice. Detectives followed minor leads. A drifter reportedly seen near her home, a young man who had done yard work for her months earlier, a neighbor who'd once borrowed tools and never returned them. None panned out, but something about the case continued to trouble them. The open envelope on her coffee table, the one addressed to a non-existent P.O. box, contained a single sheet of paper, blank except for a typewritten line near the top. You were right. No fingerprints. No return address. When Marguerite's remains were released to her family, her funeral was held quietly at Shannon Rose Hill Cemetery, the same grounds where her son Lee was buried under a small gray headstone that read simply, Lee Harvey Oswald. There were only a handful of mourners. No reporters were allowed inside the chapel. Her surviving son stood near the back, speaking little. Our next story takes place in Texas in the early 1980s. By then, Marguerite Oswald was an old woman living in a small house in Fort Worth, tucked away behind a row of elm trees that leaned toward the street as if eavesdropping. She had thinning hair, a tired posture, and the unmistakable edge of someone who had lived her entire life under suspicion. She was not famous, but her name carried a shadow, Oswald. She was the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President John F. Kennedy. For nearly 2 decades, Marguerite had lived in that narrow strip between curiosity and isolation. She granted occasional interviews to reporters, sometimes charging small fees, her voice wavering between pride and resentment. She spoke about her son with the conviction of someone who had rewritten the story in her mind many times, that he was innocent, that there were things people didn't understand, that her family had been destroyed by forces far larger than themselves. Neighbors rarely spoke to her. They described her as odd but harmless, a woman who sometimes walked to the corner store in the same worn overcoat, who carried herself like she was always halfway through a conversation with someone no one else could see. Her mailbox often overflowed with letters, some sympathetic, some hateful. She read all of them. And then, one morning in March 1981, she didn't answer her door. It was the mail carrier who noticed first. The envelopes piling up, the newspapers left untouched on her porch. After 3 days, police were called to perform a welfare check. When they entered the house, they found Marguerite Oswald lying on the living room floor, half covered by a faded blanket. The television was still on, volume low, playing a rerun of a 1970s crime show. At first, officers assumed she had died of natural causes. She was 74 years old and had been in declining health. But something about the scene didn't sit right. There were overturned papers near the couch, a phone off the hook, and an open envelope on a coffee table addressed to a Dallas post office box. One investigators later discovered didn't exist. Her body was sent for autopsy. The medical examiner noted bruising on her wrists and a fracture at the base of her skull. The official cause of death, blunt force trauma. Marguerite Oswald had been murdered. Detectives from a Fort Worth police department quickly descended on the small property. The crime scene offered almost nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to her, and no valuables missing. The wallet on her nightstand still contained $27. Her old black and white photos of her son Lee as a child, of her other sons Robert and John, were untouched. The only item that seemed out of place was a small notebook lying face down near her recliner, pages torn out from the middle. Investigators interviewed her surviving son, Robert Oswald, who lived just outside Dallas. He told them he hadn't spoken to his mother in several months. Their relationship had long been strained. Marguerite had grown increasingly paranoid in her later years, convinced she was being watched, followed, listened to. Neighbors confirmed hearing her talk about strange phone calls at night. One remembered her standing in her front yard a few weeks before her death, arguing with an unseen person, or perhaps to herself, saying, "You can't erase me." I was his mother. Detectives initially suspected a break-in gone wrong, but nothing fit the pattern. There were no prime marks on the doors, no ransacking, no signs of robbery. The medical examiner placed her time of death sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight, a window when the street would have been quiet, porch lights dimmed, and the sound of cars fading toward the highway. The television had been tuned to Channel 4, a local affiliate that aired reruns of Columbo at that hour. It played quietly through the night, flickering across the walls of her small living room, casting faint light over the armchair where she had spent most evenings. Investigators dug into her final weeks. Marguerite had been corresponding with several people across the country: amateur historians, conspiracy theorists, and those still obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. She'd become a minor figure in their circles, sometimes exchanging long letters about her son's real story. One man from Louisiana claimed she had promised to mail him new documents proving the second gunman theory. Another said she'd recently received threatening calls telling her to stop digging. Police traced the calls, but found nothing. The numbers have been dialed from payphones across multiple states: Louisiana, Arkansas, even California. None led anywhere. Still, they noticed something unusual. In her kitchen, taped to the inside of a cupboard, was a hand-drawn map. It showed several U.S. cities connected by lines and arrows, ending in Dallas. Next to it, in her small, slanted handwriting, were the words, "He didn't do it alone." The media caught the scent almost immediately. Mother of JFK assassin found dead in Fort Worth home. For a few days, the headlines reignited old ghosts. News vans parked on her quiet street, and strangers gathered outside her fence, holding cameras and microphones. Detectives had to push through the noise. They released no details about the manner of her death at first, only that it was being treated as suspicious. Rumors spread quickly, some claiming she had been silenced by government agents, others saying she'd known too much. Inside the department, the lead detective, Harold Hal Peterson, privately admitted to colleagues that the case fell off. There was something too neat about it, a crime scene that said everything and nothing at once. One clue stood out. In Marguerite's bedroom, officers found an unmarked envelope tucked inside a photo album. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph showing a woman, possibly Marguerite, standing in front of a motel somewhere along Route 67. In the background, barely visible, was a blue sedan. The date on the back of the photo, February 14th, 1981, 5 weeks before her death. No one could identify the location. They traced every motel along that stretch of road, but found no matching sign or building. The photo was faded, grainy, and oddly composed, like it had been taken without the subject's awareness. The investigation dragged on through the summer. With no suspects, no witnesses, and no apparent motive, public attention faded. By fall, the case was reassigned twice. Detectives followed minor leads. A drifter reportedly seen near her home, a young man who had done yard work for her months earlier, a neighbor who'd once borrowed tools and never returned them. None panned out, but something about the case continued to trouble them. The open envelope on her coffee table, the one addressed to a non-existent P.O. box, contained a single sheet of paper, blank except for a typewritten line near the top. You were right. No fingerprints. No return address. When Marguerite's remains were released to her family, her funeral was held quietly at Shannon Rose Hill Cemetery, the same grounds where her son Lee was buried under a small gray headstone that read simply, Lee Harvey Oswald. There were only a handful of mourners. No reporters were allowed inside the chapel. Her surviving son stood near the back, speaking little. Now, on to the next story. Austin, Texas, 1884. The city was small then, barely more than a few thousand people, lit by gas lamps that hissed softly through the night. Horses pulled carriages down dusty streets, and at the edges of the city, wooden homes leaned against the quiet, their windows thinly curtained, their doors kept loosely latched. By day, Austin was bustling with construction, new hotels, a railway line, the promise of a growing state capital. But by night, something else stirred. Between 1884 and 1885, 7 women were attacked in their sleep. Most of them were black servant girls. All of them were taken in silence. The first killing came just after Christmas, in December of 1884. Her name was Molly Smith. She worked as a servant for a family on Pecan Street, now called 6th. Her employer, a man named Walter Hall, had gone to bed around midnight. When he woke near dawn, the back door stood ajar. Molly's bed was empty. Her body was found behind the home, laid out in the snow-dusted yard, partially undressed, a single deep wound above her ear. The police arrived quickly, though there was little they could do. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, just the dull metallic scent that lingered even after the ground was cleaned. A heavy axe was found nearby. No one claimed it. At the time, Austin had no formal homicide division. The constables, mostly Civil War veterans and drifters, relied on instinct. They suspected lovers, jealous husbands, prowlers. But nothing fit. Molly's boyfriend was jailed briefly, questioned until morning, then released when his alibi held. The murder was declared unresolved. In May of the following year, another woman was killed, Eliza Shelley. She worked for a prominent Austin family, and like Molly, she was found outside her employer's home. Her skull had been crushed. The weapon was the same, a common axe, cleaned roughly and left in the yard. People began locking their doors earlier. Dogs were chained closer to porches. The city's small newspaper, the Austin Statesman, began referring to the killer as a midnight assassin. The name stuck. Over the next several months, the pattern grew clearer. Each victim was attacked in her home, usually while she slept. The killer entered through a window or an unlatched door, struck fast, and disappeared before sunrise. There was no theft, no ransom, no sign of personal motive. In September 1885, 2 more women were killed, Rebecca Ramey's daughter, a young girl, and a cook named Mary Ramey, who was found in the yard with her head split open. By now, the city was gripped with terror. Patrols roamed the streets at night. Men gathered in small groups with rifles, standing guard outside boarding houses. Then came Christmas Eve, 1885. That night, 2 more women died, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. Both white, both attacked within an hour of each other in separate neighborhoods. For the first time, the city's wealthy were touched by the violence. The killings were more brutal than before. Eula's husband, James Phillips, was found wandering the street afterward, his clothes stained with blood, muttering that someone had broken in. The police arrested him before sunrise. By morning, every paper in Texas carried the story. The Statesman called it the most fearful and mysterious crime ever committed in the state. The term servant girl annihilator appeared for the first time. The governor offered a $3,000 reward. Pinkerton detectives were summoned from Chicago. They found little. Witnesses claimed to see a tall man, sometimes barefoot, moving through alleys at night. Others said they heard whistling outside windows, followed by silence. Inside the jail, James Phillips sat in a cell for months, awaiting trial for his wife's murder. The evidence against him was thin, but the city needed someone to blame. Meanwhile, the killing stopped. By the spring of 1886, Austin began to return to its routine. The new Capitol building rose from the red clay. The newspapers grew quieter. The midnight assassin was fading into rumor. Then the strange reports began. A woman claimed to see a shadow moving along the rooftops near Congress Avenue. Another said a man had been watching her through her kitchen window for several nights, vanishing when she screamed. None of the stories could be confirmed. The Pinkerton agents returned north. The constables went back to chasing thieves and drunks. The cases were left in boxes in the courthouse basement. Decades later, a retired officer would recall the investigation. He said there were details the public was never told. That one of the axes had been sharpened with a file, not a grindstone. That footprints found near the Phillips house were bare, the toes pointing slightly outward. That a small piece of candle wax was found near one victim's bed, though no one in the house had used a candle that night. Rumors lingered. Some said the killer left for New Orleans. Others believed he joined the circus that passed through the city in early 1886. A few years later, the Whitechapel murders began in London. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic wondered if the servant girl annihilator and Jack the Ripper could have been the same man. There were similarities, the mutilations, the choice of women living on the margins, the silence of the attacks. But there was never proof. In Austin, the case faded into the dry Texas air. Streets were renamed, the wooden homes replaced by brick. The last surviving witness, a woman who had been a child during the killings, once told a reporter that her mother used to wake at the faintest sound of footsteps on the porch, years after the murders stopped. In the city's archives, the reports still exist. Handwritten pages describing women taken from their beds, one by one, their lives cut short before dawn. The words are clinical, stripped of feeling, wounds to the head, body removed from the house, property not disturbed. Nothing connects them but the pattern and the quiet certainty that whoever it was, he walked away unseen. When historians revisited the case in the 20th century, they found only fragments. The names of the victims, the incomplete police notes, the few photographs that survived. The rest have been lost in fires and floods. Even now, the story feels half-buried. The old neighborhoods where the killings took place are gone, replaced by offices and parking lots. But some of the old limestone foundations remain beneath the newer buildings. Workers digging foundations in the 1970s found iron nails, bits of cloth, and once, the rusted head of an axe. No one could say if it meant anything. At the state archives, one page from the Phillips case is marked in pencil. No further action. Suspect released. The handwriting is faint, almost rubbed away. Beneath it, another note reads, subject moved north, possibly St. Louis. There were no follow-up reports. The identity of the man who crept through the gaslit streets of Austin, entering homes in silence, was never found. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began. But sometimes in the summer heat, when the air presses still against the windows, the city feels older than it should. Streets curve where they shouldn't. Lamplight pools the same way it did back then. And every so often, someone walking alone at night swears they hear it. The faint scrape of something metal against wood, somewhere just out of sight. Now, on to the next story. It began in Moscow's northwestern districts, an area of faded apartment blocks, cold light, and long, empty courtyards that caught the sound of footsteps in winter. Between 2002 and 2006, residents started finding bodies near the rail lines that cut through those neighborhoods. At first, no one noticed the pattern. The city was large, its police overworked, its winters long. Deaths came and went quietly. But the faces, when there were faces left to recognize, had something in common. They were covered. The first was found behind a kiosk near Reknoy Vauxhall. A man in his 50s, local, an electrician. He'd been stabbed repeatedly, but his face had been wrapped in a cheap latex mask, a smiling one, the kind sold at outdoor markets during the New Year festivals. The police treated it as an isolated act of cruelty. They filed it away. A month later, a woman was found 2 districts away, in a small park half buried under snow. She had been beaten, then strangled. The same type of mask covered her face, but this one was different. Painted like a clown, its mouth frozen in an exaggerated grin. A cigarette, but lay beside her, perfectly balanced on the ice. By spring of 2003, there were 4 victims. Each death occurred within walking distance of a metro station. Each was killed at night. The bodies found the next morning by commuters or sanitation workers. No witnesses, no footprints, except those washed away by snow or rain. The tabloids called Amaska the Mask. At first, the killings drew little national attention. Moscow's crime rate was still high in those years, and the early 2000s were a time of transition. New money, new buildings, but also a strange sense of anonymity. The police followed leads that went nowhere. One detective described the feeling as chasing a shadow through fog. The investigation changed direction after the fifth victim. He was a young man, 23, found near a playground on a quiet residential street. This time, there was something different. The mask wasn't plastic. It was leather, homemade. The stitching ran unevenly across the seams, as if hand-done. Inside, forensic technicians found a faint residue of glue mixed with hair fibers that didn't belong to the victim. A task force was formed under Major Antonov, a veteran investigator known for his patience. He ordered every mask vendor in Moscow questioned. Thousands of records were checked. Imports from China, factory runs, local artisans. Nothing matched. Whoever made them had done it privately. Then, in late 2004, an elderly woman came forward. She ran a small repair shop on the outskirts of the city, near Tichino. She told police that a man had visited her several times between 2002 and 2003, asking her to mend torn gloves and occasionally strange costume pieces. When asked to describe him, she hesitated. She remembered his hands more than his face. They were covered in scars, she said. She showed them the drawer where she kept old orders. Among them was a slip of paper, faded but with the name M. Kalinev. The police ran it through their database and found a partial match. Mikhail Konstantinovich Lunev, age 41, former costume designer for a small theater troupe that had closed in 1999. No criminal record. Lived alone in a Khrushchevka block near the Sokol Metro. When officers arrived at his apartment, no one answered. The neighbors said he was quiet, polite, always carrying fabric rolls. He hadn't been seen for several days. They forced entry. The apartment was clean. Too clean. The kind of sterile order that made the detectives uneasy. In a main room, the wallpaper was stripped to the plaster. On the walls hung masks, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows. Human faces cast in plaster, others made from latex, some painted, some plain. Each bore a number written in pencil beneath it. There were 19 in total. They found no human remains, no blood, but in the corner stood an old trunk. Inside were sketches, pencil drawings of faces labeled only with dates. The earliest was 2002, the most recent 3 weeks before the raid. The media learned of it within hours. The story ran on national television. Moscow masked man, suspect found. But Lunev was nowhere to be found. His passport was missing, and his bank account had been closed months earlier. A single Metro card was left on the kitchen counter, still loaded with credit. Over the next 2 years, the murders stopped. Police believed he'd either fled or taken his own life. The masks were locked away in evidence storage, tagged, and forgotten. Until 2008. That year, a construction crew demolishing a warehouse near Koroshevo discovered a hidden room behind a bricked-over doorway. Inside, they found clothing, bones, and fragments of rubber masks half melted from heat. It looked like someone had tried to burn everything. Among the debris was a metal ID badge, corroded but legible. It read MKL. DNA testing identified the remains as belonging to 2 individuals. One was an unknown male. The other matched the profile of one of the early victims from 2003. The investigators could never explain how that was possible. After the warehouse find, rumors spread. Some claimed that Lunev hadn't worked alone, that the killings were part of something broader. A performance arts circle, a clandestine theater group obsessed with identity and death. But the files give no indication of that. What they do mention, briefly, is a single note found at the scene. It was written in neat Cyrillic script on the back of a costume invoice. When they were the face, they stopped being afraid. The handwriting didn't match any known sample from Lunev. The Moscow police closed the case in 2009, citing insufficient evidence. But unofficially, detectives kept a watch on similar incidents. Every few years, a new case appeared. A woman in St. Petersburg, a homeless man in Yaroslavl, each found with a mask over the face. Always different materials, but the same precision. No suspect has ever been confirmed. The photos from the apartment still exist in the archives, filed under Objects 1 to 19. They were never displayed publicly. One officer, years later, described them from memory. They looked almost alive. You'd swear the eyes were following you. In 2017, an anonymous parcel was delivered to a Moscow radio station. Inside was a single latex mask, pale and expressionless, folded carefully in wax paper. No note. The return address was a vacant building that had once housed the old theater troupe where Lunev worked. Police collected it. The file was reopened for 6 months. Nothing came of it. To this day, there's no record of Lunev's body ever being found. No verified sightings, no confession. His apartment block has since been renovated, the walls repainted, the neighbors replaced. But some of the older residents still say that, late at night, they sometimes hear faint footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, pausing outside certain doors. When they check, there's no one there. Only the sound of someone exhaling softly through something thin and flexible like rubber.